Welcome to the Business of Biotech, brought to you by BioProcess Online and graciously sponsored by Cytiva, formerly GE Healthcare Life Sciences. This podcast series is handcrafted specifically for the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies. As you know, if you listen to our trailer, we've secured the commitment of many biopharma entrepreneurs with loads of experience building organizations, from securing financing to building all-star teams and company valuation, to navigating regulatory and process considerations for clinical stage production. Those are just a few of the topics we'll tackle in this series, and we're kicking things off with an authoritative biopharma industry luminary who's leveraged decades of big pharma experience to lead dozens of startup biopharmas to clinical success. Let's give it a listen. So today, Allan Shaw is joining us. Thanks, Allan. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Matt. Real pleasure to be joining you guys. In way of background for everybody, I've been a four-time public company CFO. I've been at large companies like Serono when they were independent and the third largest biotech company in the world, with 3 commercial therapeutic areas, about $2 billion of top-line revenue, and we're listed on both the Swiss and U.S. New York Stock Exchanges. We also had about 5,000 employees, and we had sales in 90 countries. So I certainly know what good looks like. I know what big looks like. And more recently, I was at Syndax, a clinical stage oncology company that I helped lead their IPO with a bunch of other great team members.
Yeah.
And we had 18 people when we did the IPO, and I had about 40 people there when I left. So I also know what being entrepreneurial is. I certainly know what rolling up your sleeves are. And I also know the limitations and the resourcefulness of and nimbleness that a young aspiring organization needs. Currently, I have a portfolio of activities and involved with several private biotech companies. Helping them professionalize their organizations, build out, think about critical matters like resource allocation, prioritization, and making sure that they're aware of what their competitive edge are and making them aware of their blind spots. A lot of people know what they know, but they don't know what they don't know. I've also been a 5-time public company board of director. I used to be audit chairman on a couple of occasions. Used to think that was the worst part of governance until I became the chairman of compensation, which is by far the most thankless aspect of all the governance. And also, I've had a long-standing affiliation with Life Science Leader. I used to have a magazine column with the magazine called Deeper Dive, CFO Insider's View of the Industry's Issues, and currently have the privilege and pleasure, as well as burden, of serving on their editorial advisory board.
Yes, which is very much appreciated. I know Rob Wright speaks quite highly of you, and he suggested that we connect for this podcast. And that background is terrific, Allan, because the point you made about knowing the entrepreneurial side, but having the experience of a high level, bigger biopharma is key, because this, as you know, this podcast is dedicated to folks who are, first-time CEOs leading new and emerging biopharmas. And on today's episode, it's my intention to sort of preview the ensuing episodes by giving you just a couple of minutes, which I'm going to challenge the New Yorker in you to just spend a couple of minutes on each of these topics. And I'm going to ask you a specific question that kind of previews and highlights the episode to come in this 10 series. I'm sorry, 10 episode series podcast. So let's kick that off. In our next episode, we're going to talk about launching a business with the end in mind, which is something that probably doesn't happen a whole lot. You're a first-time founder. You're focused on the science. You've got a fundraise. You've got a therapy that has like some fundraising potential in the works. You're maybe not thinking about when it's time to start thinking about mapping out when you might seek an acquisition or go public, or whether your strategy is best to just stay private. So from your perspective, tell us, when is it time as a new CEO to start thinking about that, and why?
I think as in the world of biotech, I don't think you ever have enough money, and I think it's really important to think about your funding strategy and how you reduce your cost of capital. But I think that you only need $5 million or you just need $10 million. I mean, it does light the wick of the candle, but I think you need to think broadly speaking, how do you de-risk your programs? And I think you also need to understand, and what I've seen commonly missed by a lot of young organizations is they come across some very interesting science, but it's sometimes lacking the connection to the clinical or commercial relevancy, because this is the business of science, and it's not academia. And I'd say a lot of times younger companies are overly informed by academia, so therefore it's a lot of groupthink. And there's really a lot of blind spots to the competitive advantage, and simplistic questions of what your edge is are sometimes overlooked. So I think that needs to be somewhat fundamentally baked into your considerations as you embark on your plan. It's not a sprint; it's a marathon. I think the other thing that's I think really important to think about is, I think people, when they embark, thinking, well, all I need is that partnership. They're not necessarily thinking about, how do you maximize the value of what you're doing. And I think when you start getting involved with sophisticated folks, they're going to try to assess, your vision, where are you going? And, most people are going to want to have many shots on goal. Your outcome shouldn't be just strategic. You need to think about, but you might need to take this to the finish line. You may need to take this thing longer. And I think that builds up succession planning considerations in terms of your management team. It's just not you. People invest in teams. They invest in jockeys. Choice between a great management team and a middling asset, or a great asset and a middling management team, I would always take the former. The management team is going to figure it out. The inexperienced folks are going to somehow figure out a way to mess it up. So, I think you need to think about, your team. You need to think about your optionality. And I think you want to, in that context, and I think this is probably the most important takeaway in this, is that, you really got to think about how you're going to build a company for the long term. If you're going to think you're going to be able to just build something that you're going to flip, I think people are going to see through that. They're going to game you, and you're just not going to be credible. And it's going to translate in value at the end of the day. I think the best way, if an exit is your goal, I think the best way to go about it is building a long-term sustainable business. And if there's an interloper at the end of the day, so be it. Yeah.
All right, cool. You talked about funding obviously being a key part of the puzzle. So the episode that follows that one will focus on best practices on building your pitch. So just sort of a broad question there. It's time to seek, as a CEO of an emerging company, time to seek this important milestone of funding. What's your best advice to an emerging biopharma CEO on building a pitch deck?
I think there's a lot of different inputs that you need to think about when you're doing a pitch deck. You can't just go to Microsoft PowerPoint and pull out your pitch deck. I think you need to think about your messaging. I think you also want to build a chorus. I think, again, one of the things that people sometimes overlook is the importance of medical affairs and the development of an SAB. And I'm shocked at the number of companies that don't have SAB. And it tells you a little bit about how you're approaching development. And what are you doing in terms of bringing, real-world activities and perspective to the table to inform your development activities? It's also when investors are looking to corroborate what management's saying, they're going to want to know who the KOLs are, who's involved, who are the investigators. And if you're going to try to start doing that at in the middle of your financing efforts, that's a little late. So that's something I think you need to think about up front. You also think about your publication strategy, in terms of what you're doing, what can be published, and make sure you have your IP battened down too before you go through your publishing. I've seen unfortunate instances of people keen to publish without getting that nailed down, believe it or not. I think in addition to that, which I think are fairly fundamental, it's really, you got to answer some fundamental questions. What is your competitive advantage? What is the competitive landscape, and where do you fit in on all of that? I think it's often easy to tell people, why you're an interesting investment and why you might be different. But the other thing you need to really be mindful of is, why now? Why should I be getting involved with you now? And particularly when there's a lot of opportunities right now. It's a competitive sport right now, raising money. There's never been more money around, and there's never been more people with their hands out. And everyone's got ADD. At least that's how I approach all my engagements. If you don't get it out early, it's going to get lost, and it's going to get glossed over. So you need to get things buttoned down too. You got to have your answers to the questions. You should be going through good rehearsals with what I would call friendlies. Everybody has their circle of friends. There may be some investment banks or analysts that that aren't going to rip your head off, and that there's not going to be collateral consequences, but they can give you really, really good constructive feedback before you get out there. I would also say that this is a reiterative process, that when you've done road shows, we've switched our deck 50 times in the process, because as you deliver it, as you go through it, as you see people's reactions, there's a feedback loop, and you need to be mindful of that feedback loop so you can incorporate it. So what I would say is that when you're going out, don't hit 100 people at once. Be a little bit more metered, because you're going to make the same mistake 100 times. Yep. So you want to be a little bit more mindful of that.
That's excellent advice. You mentioned, you kind of hinted a little bit at the market that we're in right now. And I mean, it's, we were pretty stable there for a while, but financial markets are once again reminding us just how capricious they can be. So we're going to talk in a specific episode down the line here on finding funding in fill in the blank, volatile times, bear markets, bull markets, bubbles, whatever we happen to be in at that particular time. When money's not raining the way that it was, in 2006, as you mentioned, it's a very competitive sport. Where should emerging bio leaders be looking?
I guess the first thing I would say is whether your bank accounts are overflowing or running thin, I would certainly suggest that you take the same disciplined approach to the way you allocate money. I've noticed over the years that people, when their bank accounts swell, they're a little bit more lax, a little bit more disciplined, and perhaps that's human nature. But I really would encourage people to continue to deploy cash as diligently as possible. And when you're early like this, it should really be what's creating value, what is important. Make sure your expenses are gated, and protect yourself. I think extending your runway is probably the most important thing. Is you don't want to run out of cash. And there's a tendency for people to get in front of their skis. They underestimate the time it's going to take to raise money, and you want to maintain your business momentum. And that's all in the backdrop that time is the enemy. So that you're trying to solve for a bunch of multifactorial things at the same time.
Yeah.
What I would say in terms of funding in volatile times, it's like blood. Cash flow is the most important thing in terms of maintaining a company's operatable capabilities. So, I think you need to be resourceful. You need to be thoughtful. And again, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. It's about preserving choices. And it's all relative to where a company is in their capital formation. As a private company, there's certainly the traditional pedigree investors, which make it generally easier to go public because, you need to bring your own beer to the party, and people use that as validation. Reverse merges become an opportunity that are, I wouldn't say, I guess they're becoming increasingly in vogue. They used to be viewed as a pariah. I kind of viewed them as a little bit of akin to a breech birth, but you're being born still. And, after you land on your feet, you're as good as the guy that came out the other way. So there's there's really no difference, but it's just not as elegant. And you need to develop an investor base, and you got to understand that there's a lot of wood to chop to get there at the end of the day. But that's certainly become, and when you look at the fact that we've had a historical level of IPOs over the last 6 years, I'd say probably about 50% of those companies are going to be likely to become zombie companies at the end of the day. So there seems to be a long opportunity for reverse merge candidates. Not all of them come filled with gas, but again, if you can bring your own liquidity to those things, they're viable ways of getting out. And I think it also enables you to think a little bit about, the best time to how you reduce your cost of capital. And I'm not sure this is a question you're going to ask me later or not in terms of going public or staying private. But, in that respect, I've given this a lot of consideration and have had to deal with this, particularly when we were looking to go out in 2016 with Syndax, where the market was really imploding at the time. It was probably, if you look at the last 7 years, that was probably the worst year to do an IPO. And I remember when we went to launch our IPO, the front page of the the Wall Street Journal that day said the IPO market was closed. I remember my son laughing, looking at me, said, "Dad, what's so funny?" And I said, "It's actually quite sad. We're going to be meeting with the board today and the bankers in order to launch our IPO for next Monday. And this is what everyone's reading right now." And everyone asked us, why go now? Why are you doing this? And I think bottom line is you can't time the market. You want to be able to reduce your cost of capital. You have to also look at in terms of where your timelines are. And, if you get too close to them, people don't want to invest. If you wait till after some of those readouts, sometimes they're not bright lines. They can be gray. So, you need, so there's a lot of different considerations. And the other thing, too, is as a public company, when you have data readouts, you can pivot much better than a private company. You can do a financing the next day that fundamentally reduces your cost of capital. So, there's a lot of different factors in terms of that. And I guess really the bottom line is you just simply can't time the market. And when you're thinking about going public, it's very distracting organizationally. And if you're on the runway waiting for the windows to open, that can create a level of paralysis organizationally where nothing gets done.
The Business of Biotech podcast is dedicated to helping new and emerging biopharma leaders navigate the organizational, financial, and regulatory aspects of the biotherapeutics market landscape. So is Cytiva, the company formerly known as GE Healthcare Life Sciences, and the gracious underwriters of this project. Find out how Cytiva is helping life science researchers and biopharmaceutical manufacturers evolve how new therapies and precision medicines are discovered, made, and used at www.cytiva.com. That's www.cytiva.com. Yeah, you can't time the market, but one thing you can do is build or attempt to build the valuation of your company through your talent. So we're going to talk in a later episode specifically about assembling a biotech all-star team. Help me understand, illustrate for me the direct line between talent and company valuation. What's priority number one as far as talent goes, and where do I find it?
This is the business of science. So, I think you need to make sure that you've got, for me, going past the CEO, probably the most fundamental position in the organization is a chief medical officer. I think that kind of helps tie a lot of this execution together. It ties medical affairs in. It reduces your execution risk, and it's no secret that it's probably the hardest position to find right now because there's more demand than overall supply. But I think everyone has their functional strengths, but then you also have your general blind spots. So I think you need to work collaboratively in a non-siloed approach, which becomes increasingly challenged in this virtual company mentality that we go into, where people are scattered about and you don't have the same kind of water cooler conversations that you might otherwise have. So, effective communication and coordination is key in order and have an open and an environment that stimulates an open dialogue. I think you also need, thinking about it more from a functional perspective, I think you need adults in the room, right? I've been helping a lot of companies, and I kind of view this as helping them professionalize, providing adult supervision and helping them identify what they don't know. I think on that front, I think having a regulatory strategy makes sense. Time is the enemy, and if there's ways that you can do things thoughtfully on a regulatory perspective to squeeze time and shorten the length of things, or take advantage of accelerations that the FDA may enable you to do, I think those are things that one should be able to understand, and I think investors appreciate it. The development side is critical. In terms of operations, you need good CMC and drug supply. So my sense is for young companies, it's those are sometimes viewed as luxuries. And so, I think there's a movement now moving towards fractionalization, where you can really get, highly qualified, experienced folks who are involved with a handful of different companies. And candidly, that everyone benefits from that.
Yeah.
Your overhead, you bring in the right expertise, and because they're in the circle working with a whole bunch of other people, they're highly relevant to the different manufacturers or different other regulatory agencies. So therefore, they actually bring a lot more gravitas to the table than you might otherwise consider. The other area that I think doesn't really get a lot of appreciation, and I think this speaks to culture, it gets to people, and it's about not just being able to recruit people, but to retain people, which particularly when you get into the Boston area, that in itself is another competitive sport. So I think human resources is an area that helps set the tone. If you having a human resource person that has a seat at the table, I think everybody understands that's a proxy for where the people and the employees sit. So, I think that's important. And again, people view that as a luxury. And, I think when you're building a team, I think that's probably the most important investment that you make at the end of the day.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting take. I wouldn't have guessed that would. CMO, scientific, intellectual property kind of stuff. I could see coming, but the HR point it's an interesting one.
And there's a lot of good fractional folks there too that can be helpful there.
Yeah.
But that definitely, I think you need to take a holistic approach to your organization. And I also think, and this isn't an infomercial for finance guys, but I think there's a lot of times where people think all you need is a controller, all you need is a bookkeeper, and that certainly keeps the trains running on time. No ifs, ands, and buts, and that's what people are caring about. But if you're looking at somebody who's going to, challenge the resource allocation, provide a little value in terms of the prioritizations, and kind of connect things from an investor perspective that people may not see, you can save a lot of time and money if you get that kind of context incorporated up front.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, time is the enemy, and people look at the way you prioritize things, and they're figuring, if that's how you're going to spend your money, I guess that's going to be the way you're going to spend my money, and yeah. And you're indicting yourself unintentionally.
Yeah. So we've kind of gone through finance, HR, organizational strategy. Wrapping up the first half of this series, we're going to talk a bit about once these things are in place, knowing when it's time to leave the incubator. I mean, the incubator is a safe, kind of comfortable place, but ultimately growth limiting to a new company. What development and financial milestones do you look for that make it clear to a new or emerging biopharma CEO that it's time to leave the nest?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that, my general feeling is that no one is investing in you because of your facility. Typically, again, maybe labs and other. It depends on the nature of the organization. But to me, you want to keep your overhead low. There's no value in G&A expenses. So I guess my compass would be to keep overhead low. I think, in terms of when you run out of space, when you want to try to get people more under one roof. And from what I've observed, there's a lot of what I would call halfway houses that you can leave the incubator, but you get into these science parks or organizations, the Alexandria complexes offer a great location for companies to move out where you're still kind of in a collaborative environment with other companies. There may be other cost-effective options, relative to the example I just provided. But I think it's really when my personal perspective is when you've got a pathway to really de-risking your programs and moving into the clinic, strikes me is the best time. I mean, I realize people may, again, depending on what you're doing, you may have more traction as a preclinical company, but I would certainly wait until you need to and keep your expenses down and take advantage of the things that these organizations provide for you, because again, it gets dilutive when you start moving out of those things and you're spending your time and you're spending your money on things that don't create value. And I people forget that.
Yeah, that's a good segue point. At that point in our series, we're going to segue into more quality, regulatory, and CMC concerns. So that's an excellent point you just made to kind of transition to the kickoff of season 2 in this series. We're going to kick that off with an episode on the quality data necessary for FDA submissions. When you're a new CEO, maybe a first-time CEO of biopharma, and you've never seen the regulatory infrastructure, the regulatory animal, if you will, that can equal risk, at least in your mind. How does quality data serve to de-risk the impending CMC and process scale-up exercise?
You got to be careful about garbage in, garbage out. So you do want to make sure you have the right controls, right oversight. I would encourage people that they think if they provide outsource things to a CRO, that they're abdicated of that. And that's I think, a misunderstanding. And, I think they should, manage the CRO. They should certainly have clinical research assistants that are working with these guys and providing that level of oversight. One of the companies I was involved with, we were working with an affiliation of the NIH, and we threw additional resources in there from a data resource perspective in order to make sure that it was a beyond approach. And that's not something to be underestimated at the end of the day. In terms of that. So I think, and I'd also encourage people, because again, going back to time is the enemy, which I think is a general theme here, is I would not be shy to make sure you've got the right regulatory advisors, whether they're in-house, whether they're outsourced, whether they're part-time. But you do not want to be doing this without the right chaperones.
Yep. You had alluded earlier to outsourcing not just services but talent. Specific people, the virtual company idea, and you just mentioned it again. Do you see that trend? This is total diatribe. I'm going off on a tangent, and I don't want to go too far down it. But do you see that trend perhaps catching on more today, given the current situation with coronavirus, for instance? I mean, do you see that kind of fueling the virtual biopharma trend?
I think the horse is kind of out of the barn. I think the coronavirus kind of it doesn't impact it, and I think, at least from what I'm observing, the biotech stocks are holding up better. I don't think the investment community is that that smart, but I think it may cause it to be more proliferate in other places. But do
you think in that space it's already on the way? Yeah,
absolutely.
Cool.
I'd say this is the more than less.
Yeah. All right. Good. All right. So we're going to continue season 2 talking about good manufacturing processes. And when you look at GMP, it's sort of I characterize it as prescriptive, yet the means to the end is somewhat flexible. So what's your best advice for new biopharmas to maintain flexibility in the capacity and production decisions that they make, yet still reach those GMP milestones that are so necessary?
Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly with the advent of gene therapy, where now people are starting to think about bringing some of these processes in house, it's a question that's being debated more than it's ever been. But as a general observation, in terms of CMC, I would characterize it as arguably one of the most underappreciated functionalities in all of life sciences or in biopharma. I think it's akin to kind of like the offensive line of a football team, where no one seems to care until there's a penalty on the field. It's not one of the sexy areas. It's one of these things that, it's a living definition of where risk management could really be done up front to avoid all these infractions, which are at record levels coming out of the FDA in turn. So with that, and consequently, it's if you think about gating factors in terms of getting your drugs approved after safety and efficacy, it's CMC. So it's an area that I think people should really pay much closer attention to. Make sure they have the right professionals in place to address that, because it's an issue, and it's going to be an issue too because VCs are going to be challenging this. So you need to really have your arms around it. And candidly, one of the things that I think companies, period, but I think young companies have probably a higher inclination, is that the availability of drug supply is probably one of the greatest rate limiting gates in terms of initiating clinical studies. And if you don't have that drug supply sorted out in a timely manner, you're going to miss your timelines. Missing timelines have implications in terms of credibility with investors. And candidly, your timelines move out. You're still burning overhead, and therefore you're actually burning you're reducing your cash runway at the end of the day. Mm. So again, these things can be extremely costly.
Yeah. That's you kind of tackled episodes 2 and 3 around GMP and CMC at the same time there. But when it comes to CMC considerations for first-in-human studies, you've been there. Here's a funny question. What happens to a first-time biopharma CEO's blood pressure around the risks associated with CMC considerations in first-in-human studies, and how do they mitigate that risk?
Well, I guess depending on the upfront tox, that will reduce some of your anxiety. If there's a history of monkey fatalities or rodent deaths, I would assume you're going to be a little bit more anxious. Yeah. and would question the wisdom of moving forward. But I think there's a couple of interesting considerations. I mean, I think one is you've got to make sure your tox profiles are done, and I would encourage you to get those things to the extent it can be done cost effectively. Try to do that before you scale up on your manufacturing, because it would really be a problem if you invested all this money and then you're doing your tox before you go into man, and then you just have to throw everything out. So I think you need to be thoughtful about the gates again. And I think the other thing, and whether it's first in human or as you're trying to line up your studies, you're doing a safety study and you're trying to make sure you got enough supply to move into phase 2, which seems to be a consideration. You should really just make sure, and if you're in oncology in particular, where if you're doing safety, people are still looking for signals. And if you're not getting a signal there, your phase 2 may not have the legs or the justification. I think you don't want to commit $500,000, $1 million, whatever it might be, to buy the drug product before you know that you're going to be definitively doing that study. So, making sure you've got those gates in front before, because that'll also create a lot of anxiety to first-time CEOs, that you've just wasted $1 million on a study that you're not going to be doing.
Yeah.
Try explaining that to your investors.
Sure. Yeah, right. Okay, and then we're running short on time here, but real quick, I want to touch on the wrap-up episode. We're going to talk about gap analysis and next steps. So, assessment of your current development status, identifying holes, and then using that to guide next steps. Give us a little on that, and maybe tell us, in your experience, what mistakes you've seen made there and how to avoid them.
I think it's just it's healthy to exercise to continually reassess your organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The traditional SWOT analysis. I think that because it's a very fluid environment, I think people really forget about that this is a competitive sport. There's a lot of competition out there, and you need to understand the relevancy of your activities. This is the business of science, particularly in oncology. It's breathtaking how quickly these programs are moving, and how good science is being cannibalized by good science. And it's a challenge. You're making this business decisions, you're allocating capital that really you're looking at 5-10-year timelines from when you kick off these programs to when you hope to get to the commercial finish line. And there's a lot of different things that can get in the way along the way. And I think you need to be mindful of those things and have the organizational sophistication, awareness, and confidence to pivot when things need to pivot. I think a wise man once put to me that if you make a wrong turn and continue going down the road, it's still a wrong turn.
Yeah.
And the longer you take to identify that U-turn, there's longer time to catch up, and you're throwing good money after bad money. I think one of the things that people have, what I would suggest is that anything that's not working, kill it, and move forward. Keeping things around because you're afraid of what it means, or you think you need your job, those are not sustainable strategies at the end of the day. And to me, it's about your credibility and your integrity. And if you talk truthfully and transparent and have a plan, right? Again, it goes back to my comments earlier about optionality and choice and looking at how, if this door is closed, you open up this one, and you open up this window if this is closed. But I think you do need to gate things, and you need to kill things early.
Awesome. I'll tell you what, Allan, I'm pretty sure I gave you the hardest job of the entire series, in that I asked you to come on and spend a few minutes talking about every single topic we're going to cover in the upcoming podcast series. So I really appreciate your willingness to do that. Rob told me that this guy will do anything, so he said he can do anything. I appreciate your insight.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun, and if I could be helpful on any of the other episodes, feel free to ring my bell.
I will. I'm going to take you up on that for sure. I'll be back in touch with you to map that out. But in the meantime, Allan Shaw, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Pleasure. Cheers.
That's Allan Shaw. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech, produced by BioProcess Online and graciously sponsored by Cytiva, formerly GE Healthcare Life Sciences. If you like what you heard here today, subscribe, give us 5 stars, and be sure to subscribe to the BioProcess Online newsletter at bioprocessonline.com. Tune in next time for a deep dive on making your exit plan, whether that's seeking an IPO, a merger, or staying private, from day one with Dr. Francois Nader. In the meantime, thanks for listening.